You know, and unfortunately, I never got to see him live. I never got to see him in, you know, on TV or anything. I was just influenced. I mean, of course, you look at me and even though my goatee isn't the same as his.
He inspired me. Scott Steiner just named 10 wrestlers who shaped him into the icon we know today. And when you actually look at this list, it tells a story Scott probably never meant to reveal. Because these 10 names are not just influences, they are the instruction manual. The blueprint for how a Michigan amateur wrestler with zero charisma turned himself into Big Poppa Pump by copying everyone who came before him. Think about it. Scott Steiner is one of the most recognizable characters in wrestling history. The bleached blonde hair and goatee, the obscene muscles he calls his peaks, the chainmail coif, the promos about mathematics that made absolutely no sense but somehow became legendary anyway. When you see Big Poppa Pump, you see something that feels original, something wild and unpredictable, a genetic freak. But that is the con, because before all the theater and the screaming and the posing, Scott Steiner was just Scott Steiner, a quiet college kid from Michigan, a Greco-Roman wrestler with Olympic caliber throws and the personality of a brick wall. He was good, really good, but boring, forgettable, the kind of guy who would have had a solid run in the territories and then disappeared into a coaching job somewhere. So what happened? What changed Scott Steiner into Big Poppa Pump? The answer is theft. Calculated, deliberate, shameless theft. 10 men gave him the pieces, and Scott stitched them together into something that looked new. If you like this kind of behind-the-scenes wrestling story, use the hype feature and give this video some hype, because what we are about to uncover is uncomfortable. Scott Steiner did not build Big Poppa Pump. He borrowed it, stole it, copied it from 10 legends who came before, and the deeper we go into this list, the clearer the pattern becomes. Every promo style, every visual choice, every career move, all of it taken from someone else. Scott's genius was not in creating anything original. It was in knowing which pieces to steal and how loud to scream while doing it. By the end of this video, you will see Big Poppa Pump differently, not as a character, but as a collage, a Frankenstein monster sewn together from the spare parts of wrestling history. Let's start at number 10 and count down to the influence that mattered most, the one that gave Scott the entire look and attitude that made him famous. Number 10, Greg Wojciechowski, the Great Wojo. Here is a name that probably means nothing to you. Most wrestling fans have never heard of Greg Wojciechowski. He was not a household name. He never main evented WrestleMania. He never held a major world title for years. But to Scott Steiner, Wojo represents something crucial. The first victim. The first proof that Scott could take a legitimate athlete and beat them in their own game. August 14th, 1986. Dearborn, Michigan. Scott Steiner's professional wrestling debut. His very first match. And he did not lose. He did not even struggle. He won the World Wrestling Association World Heavyweight Championship in his debut against a 3-time NCAA All-American wrestler, against an Olympic alternate, against someone with a legitimate amateur pedigree that matched Scott's own. That is not how debuts work. You are supposed to lose. You are supposed to pay your dues. You are supposed to spend years working your way up before you ever touch a championship. But Scott Steiner walked into that ring on day one and took the title. And he did it against someone who could have exposed him if Scott was not good enough. Wojciechowski was not a jobber. He was not some washed-up veteran doing Scott a favor. He was a legit grappler, a real wrestler who understood holds and leverage and technique, the kind of opponent who would make you look foolish if you could not hang. But Scott did not just hang, he dominated. And that victory became the foundation of everything Scott would claim about himself for the next 35 years. The idea that he was superior, that he was a genetic freak, that he could out-wrestle anyone. It all starts with Wojo, because beating a real athlete gave Scott permission to act like he was better than everyone else. It gave him credibility, and Scott rode that credibility hard. Every time he cut a promo calling someone a fat ass or a piece of trash, he was leaning on this moment. He beat Wojo, so he must be legit. The problem is that Scott never let that moment go. He built an entire identity around being the superior athlete, and it worked because he had Wojo's name on his record. One match, one win, and Scott turned it into a career-long excuse to look down on everyone. Wojo gave Scott something more valuable than a title. He gave him ammunition, proof that could never be taken away, and Scott weaponized it. Number 9, Road Warrior Hawk, Michael Hegstrand. If you were a tag team in the 1980s or 90s and you wanted to know if you mattered, there was one test. Could you hang with the Road Warriors? Hawk and Animal were not just a tag team. They were a cultural phenomenon. The shoulder pads, the spikes, the face paint, the absolute destruction they brought to every match. They looked like they crawled out of a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and they wrestled like they wanted to send you to one. For Scott and Rick Steiner, the Road Warriors were the measuring stick, the standard, the goal you had to reach if you wanted anyone to take you seriously as a powerhouse team. And Hawk was half of that equation, the wild one, the unpredictable one, the one who brought an edge of genuine danger to everything he did. Hawk represented something Scott chased for his entire career. The idea that you could be huge, muscular, physically imposing, and still move like an athlete, that you could look like a monster and back it up with real athleticism. The Road Warriors did not need long promos. They did not need complicated storylines. They just showed up, destroyed their opponents, and left. That simplicity was the model, and Scott studied it closely. When the Steiner brothers finally got their shot against the Road Warriors, it was not just another match. It was validation. If you could survive a match with Hawk and Animal, you belonged in the conversation. If you could make them look beatable, even for a moment, you were elite. Scott knew that. He understood that beating the Road Warriors, or even just competing with them, would elevate the Steiner brothers into legendary status. And that is exactly what happened. The matches between the Steiners and the Road Warriors were brutal, physical, the kind of stiff, intense battles that felt real. And that pushed Scott to innovate, to find new ways to stand out. Because you could not just be another big guy when you were in the ring with Hawk. You had to do something they could not. That is where Scott's aerial moves came in. The Frankensteiner, the flying moves that should not have been possible for someone his size. Hawk taught Scott that being big was not enough. You had to be unforgettable, and Scott took that lesson seriously. Number 8, Road Warrior Animal, Joe Laurinaitis. Animal was more than just the other half of the Road Warriors to Scott Steiner. He was a friend, a mentor, someone Scott respected not just as an opponent, but as a human being. And that relationship tells you something important about how Scott operated. He could separate the work from the real. He could respect someone personally while trying to destroy them professionally. And Animal was proof of that. Scott has talked openly about the time he spent with Animal, the road trips, the conversations, the bond they built over years of traveling from town to town. And one of the stories Scott loves to tell involves buying a car from Animal early in his WCW career, a Lincoln Continental. Now that might sound like a random detail, just a transaction between two wrestlers, but it meant something. It showed that Animal saw Scott as an equal, as someone worth doing business with, as someone who had arrived. That car was not just transportation, it was a symbol, proof that Scott had made it, that he was running in the same circles as one of the biggest names in the business. And Scott never forgot that. The respect between Scott and Animal was built on a shared understanding. They were both heavyweights, both guys who could have coasted on their size and their look, but neither of them did. They pushed themselves, they moved, they innovated. They refused to wrestle like the typical big man, and that created a competitive bond. Scott has said that despite the Road Warriors' intimidating size and presence, he and Rick had the confidence to compete with them physically. Their amateur wrestling backgrounds gave them an edge. They knew how to use leverage, how to counter strength with technique, how to make the big guys look beatable, and that led to some of the most brutal and intense tag matches of the 1990s. Matches that fans still talk about. Matches that defined what a powerhouse tag match could be. When Animal passed away, Scott went to his funeral. That tells you everything you need to know. This was not just a work relationship. This was genuine friendship, genuine respect that lasted decades. Animal represented the powerhouse blueprint that Scott built his entire tag team career around. The idea that you could be massive and still be an athlete, that you could be friends with your rivals, that you could respect someone and still try to tear their head off in the ring. Animal gave Scott a standard to chase, a friendship that grounded him, and a model for how to be a big man in wrestling without being boring. Number 7, Randy Savage, the Macho Man, Randy Poffo. In 1993, while Scott Steiner was working for the WWF, he formed an unlikely friendship with one of the biggest stars in the company, Randy Savage, the Macho Man, the guy with the raspy voice and the flying elbows and the intensity that made every match feel like it mattered. And Scott absorbed everything, the road trips, the stories, the paranoia, the lessons about how to survive in a business built on politics and betrayal. Savage was not like the other top guys. He did not trust easily. He did not play the company game. He kept his guard up, and he had reasons. Savage believed that everyone in wrestling was out to bury him, to steal his spot, to push him down, and he was especially suspicious of Hulk Hogan, the golden boy, the face of the company. The guy who Savage believed had held him back for years. Scott watched how Savage operated, how he treated every interaction like a negotiation, how he never let his guard down, how he stayed sharp and ready for betrayal. And Scott adopted that mindset. He saw that being nice got you nowhere, being trusting got you buried. You had to be paranoid, defensive, ready to fight for your spot at all times. The stories Scott tells about Savage are revealing, like the time they had a contest to see who could make make cows in a pasture come to them first. Savage apparently won, and Scott tells that story with genuine affection because it shows the human side of Savage, the weird, eccentric, competitive side that existed alongside the paranoia. But the more important lessons were professional. Savage taught Scott how to protect himself, how to read the politics, how to know when management was trying to screw you, and Scott carried those lessons forward. Years later, when Scott went on his famous shoots about Hogan, a lot of what he said echoed Savage's beliefs. Scott claimed that Savage hated Hogan until the day he died, that Hogan inducting Savage into the Hall of Fame was hypocritical and fake, that Hogan had spent years holding Savage down. Scott was not just defending Savage's memory, he was channeling the philosophy Savage had taught him, that loyalty matters, that you do not forget who screwed you, that the business is full of snakes. Savage's promos were legendary, unpredictable, intense. They felt dangerous, like he might break character at any second and say something that was too real. Scott copied that energy. His Big Poppa Pump promos had the same edge, the same feeling that anything could happen, that Scott might go off script and shoot on someone. Savage showed him how to blur the line between work and reality, how to make people uncomfortable, how to use intensity and unpredictability as weapons, and Scott ran with it. By the time Scott became Big Poppa Pump, he was channeling Randy Savage's paranoia, loyalty, and edge. The idea that wrestling was war, that you had to be ready to fight at all times, that the office was always trying to bury you, that mindset became core to who Scott was, and it all came from the time he spent with the Macho Man on the road in 1993. Number 6, George the Animal Steel, Jim Myers, a high school teacher and coach from Michigan who lived a double life for 25 years. By day, he was an educator, respected, professional, teaching kids in Madison Heights. By night, he was a green-tongued monster who ate turnbuckles and acted like a caveman. George Steele was the bridge, the connection that brought the Steiner family into professional wrestling, and without him, the Steiner brothers might never have existed. Steele saw potential in Rick first. After Rick graduated from the University of Michigan with his wrestling credentials, Steele recruited him into the business, told him there was money to be made, showed him that amateur wrestlers could succeed in the professional ranks if they were willing to adapt. And when Rick went pro, Scott followed. It was that simple. Steele opened the door. But his influence went much deeper than just making introductions. Steele proved something critical, that a legitimate athlete could become a star by embracing an outrageous persona. Steele had a bachelor's degree, a master's degree. He was a real educator with a respectable career. But in the ring, he was an animal. Literally, he acted feral, uncivilized. He spoke in grunts. He chewed on turnbuckles. He played a character that was as far from Jim Myers the teacher as you could possibly get, and it worked for decades. Steele made good money. He became famous. He worked for the WWF during their biggest expansion, and he did it all by being a freak. Scott watched that. He saw Steele balance two completely different identities, the legitimate athlete and the cartoon character, and he learned that being normal was not the path to success in wrestling. Being boring was career death, but being outrageous, being willing to go full character, that was how you survived. That was how you made money. Years later, when Scott needed to reinvent himself, he remembered Steele's lesson. He could have stayed Scott Steiner, the quiet, technically sound wrestler, but that version of himself was not going to main event. That version was not going to sell tickets. So he became Big Poppa Pump. He went full character, full absurdity. He leaned into the freak show, and it worked. Steele also represented something else, the Michigan Pipeline, a network of wrestlers who came from the amateur mats and made it to the national stage. Steele was proof that the path existed, that you could come from Ann Arbor or Detroit or Madison Heights and end up on television, that you did not have to be from Texas or Tennessee to succeed. Scott owes his entire career to George Steele, the introduction to the business, the lesson about character work, the proof that freaks survive longer than normal wrestlers. Without Steele, Scott would have been just another college wrestler who never went pro. Instead, he became a legend, and that started with the animal. Number 5, Rick Steiner, Robert Rex Steiner, the brother, the foundation, the person who made absolutely everything possible, and the person Scott eventually betrayed to save his own career. Rick is the most complicated influence on this list because unlike the others, Rick was not just a mentor or a benchmark or a style to copy. Rick was family, blood, the person Scott trusted more than anyone, and Scott turned on him anyway. Let's start with what Rick gave Scott. Rick entered professional wrestling first in 1983. 3 years before Scott, he learned the business, built relationships, earned respect. And when Scott was ready to make the jump from amateur wrestling to professional, Rick brought him in. Rick was the guide, the protector, the person who knew the territory system and the politics and how to navigate a business full of sharks. Together, they became the Steiner brothers, and they were incredible. One of the greatest tag teams in wrestling history. history. Rick was the dog-faced gremlin, the intense, barking madman in the headgear. Scott was the athlete, the one doing Frankensteiner's off-the-top rope, the one hitting suplexes that should not have been possible for a man his size. They were perfect complements. Rick brought the character and the toughness. Scott brought the technical skill and the innovation, and they dominated everywhere they went. The WWF, WCW, New Japan Pro Wrestling. They won titles in every promotion. They main evented shows. They had legendary matches against the Road Warriors, the Nasty Boys, Money Incorporated, and every other top team of the era. The Steiner brothers were not just successful, they were respected. Fans loved them, wrestlers respected them. They were the total package. But here is where the story gets uncomfortable. By 1998, Scott was feeling trapped. The Steiner brothers had been together for almost a decade. They had won everything there was to win as a team, and Scott started to realize something terrifying. Tag team wrestlers do not become world champions. They do not main event pay-per-views as single stars. They do not get the big money. They get stuck, buried as a tag guy, forever. And Scott could feel it happening. WCW management was not pushing the Steiner brothers like they used to. Younger teams were getting spotlight. The NWO was taking over the main event scene, and Scott felt like he was being phased out, like management was trying to keep the thumb on him to make sure he never rose above his station. So Scott made a choice. He turned on Rick. Super Brawl, 1998. Scott joined the New World Order. He attacked his own brother, destroyed the team, destroyed the bond, and he has admitted why he did it. Desperation. He felt like if he stayed with Rick, his career was over. He would be trapped in the tag division forever. He would never get a shot at the world title. He would never be a main event star. So he broke the team. He reinvented himself. He became Big Poppa Pump. Loud, outrageous, impossible to ignore, and it worked. Scott became WCW World Heavyweight Champion. He main evented pay-per-views. He cut promos that people still remember today. He became a star. But the price was betraying the person who built him. Rick gave Scott everything: a career, partnership, protection from the politics, a family bond that should have been unbreakable. And Scott threw it away to save himself. That is the core of who Scott Steiner became. Someone willing to do whatever it took to avoid being buried, even if it meant stepping over his own brother. The Steiners eventually reconciled. They were inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame together in 2022. Scott has talked about letting go of the bad feelings, about growing up and moving on, but the damage was done. The turn at Super Brawl 1998 defined Scott's career. It showed that he would sacrifice anything, including family, to stay on top. That desperation, that selfishness, that willingness to burn bridges, it all came from the fear of being forgotten. And Rick was the first casualty. Number 4, Steve Fraser, the Olympic gold medalist, the first American to ever win a gold medal in Greco-Roman wrestling at the 1984 Olympics, and the man who gave Scott Steiner his entire in-ring arsenal. Fraser was a coach at the University of Michigan during Scott's time there, and he taught Scott something that most professional wrestlers never learn: the actual science of throwing human beings. Not choreographed spots, not worked moves that look good but have no foundation. Real Greco-Roman throws designed to generate maximum force and send opponents flying. Fraser taught Scott the step-around suplexes, the explosive overhead throws, the mechanics of the Northern Lights suplex, the belly-to-back suplex, the variations that became Scott's signature. And these were not just professional wrestling moves. They were adaptations of legitimate Olympic-level techniques, moves that were designed to win actual wrestling matches. And Scott brought them into professional wrestling with devastating effect. When Scott hit a suplex, it did not look worked, it looked real. Opponents flew across the ring like they had been launched from a catapult. Their backs hit the mat with sickening force, and fans could tell the difference. They could feel that what Scott was doing was different from what other wrestlers were doing. It was legitimate, and that legitimacy became Scott's calling card. Fraser's influence was especially important in Japan. New Japan Pro Wrestling valued strong style. They valued athletic credibility. They wanted wrestlers who could actually wrestle, not just guys who looked good, and Scott delivered. His matches in New Japan are still legendary because of how stiff and real they looked, because of how he could throw guys like Hiroshi Hase or Masahiro Chono around like they weighed nothing. That credibility came from Fraser, from the hours spent learning proper technique, from understanding leverage and timing and how to generate power. Scott has talked about how those collegiate techniques allowed him to toss larger opponents around with an ease that looked both impressive and dangerous. And that was the key. It had to look effortless. If it looked like Scott was struggling, the magic was gone. But when he could hit an overhead belly-to-belly on a 250-pound opponent and make it look easy, that sold the genetic freak character. That made people believe Scott really was superior. Fraser gave Scott the tools, the actual wrestling ability that separated him from the bodybuilders and the characters who could not work. And Scott rode that technical foundation all the way to the top. Number 3, Dick the Bruiser, William Afflis, a former football player turned legendary brawler and promoter. Bruiser was the man who promoted the event where Scott debuted, that show in Dearborn in 1986. And Bruiser believed in Scott enough to put the world title on him in his very first match. Think about how insane that is. You do not give someone a championship in their debut. You do not hand a world title to an untested rookie, unless you see something special. And Bruiser saw it in Scott. He ran the World Wrestling Association, a promotion built on toughness, real fighters, blue-collar brawlers who could actually go. Bruiser valued legitimacy above everything else, and Scott had it in spades. But Bruiser gave Scott more than just a title. He gave him access to the old territory system, the road stories, the lessons about how to survive in a business full of cutthroats and politicians. Scott has described Bruiser as a trip, someone who told him things about the wrestling business that fundamentally shaped how Scott saw the industry for the rest of his career. Bruiser taught Scott that wrestling was not about being the best technical worker. It was not about having the smoothest matches or the prettiest moves. It was about being tough enough that people could not push you around, wild enough that they could not control you, loud enough that they could not ignore you. Scott absorbed that philosophy completely. He carried it with him through every promotion he ever worked for. The idea that if you let people walk on you, they will. So you have to be aggressive, uncontrollable, a problem, because problems get dealt with. And being dealt with means getting paid. Bruiser also gave Scott room to innovate. It was during his run in the World Wrestling Association in 1987 that Scott reportedly performed the first 450 splash, a move that combined the explosive power of a heavyweight with the agility of a cruiserweight. That willingness to push boundaries, to try things that big men were not supposed to be able to do, that came from working under someone like Bruiser, someone who valued being different, being memorable, being impossible to forget. Bruiser gave Scott his first title, his first real taste of success, and the mindset that carried him to the very top of the industry. Number 2, the original Sheik, Ed Farhat, the man who trained Scott Steiner in 1986, the hardcore legend who ran big-time wrestling out of Detroit and terrified audiences for decades. The Sheik was not a traditional trainer. He did not teach pretty wrestling. He did not focus on chain wrestling or technical holds. He taught brutality. He taught how to make people believe you were actually hurting your opponent, how to make violence look real, and he taught submissions, specifically the camel clutch, a move the Sheik made famous over his long career as the wild man from Syria. Scott took that move and evolved it. He turned it into the Steiner recliner, a standing variation that showcased Scott's muscular frame, his massive arms, his chest. The recliner became Scott's primary finishing move, the hold that ended matches and made opponents tap out, and it came directly from the Sheik. But the Sheik's influence went far beyond one move. It was philosophical. The Sheik represented old-school wrestling, the idea that the business was supposed to feel dangerous, that when fans watched a match, they should believe someone might actually get hurt, that the violence should feel real, not choreographed. Scott carried that mentality into his own career, especially later when he became Big Poppa Pump. His matches felt reckless, out of control, like Scott might actually injure his opponent or himself at any moment. That chaos, that unpredictability, that came from the Sheik. The Sheik also connected Scott to the Detroit territory, to Cobo Hall, to a fan base that valued toughness over everything else. Fans who did not care about fancy moves or complicated stories. They wanted to see someone get destroyed. And the Sheik taught Scott how to deliver that, how to work a hardcore style, how to brawl, how to use the environment. The Sheik trained other innovators too. Sabu, Rob Van Dam, guys who pushed the boundaries of what wrestling could be. And Scott was part of that lineage. The Sheik gave Scott his foundation, the fundamental skills to transition from amateur wrestling to professional violence, and the core belief that being normal was weakness, that if you wanted to survive in this business, you had to be willing to be brutal. Number 1, superstar Billy Graham, the biggest influence, the blueprint, the DNA of Big Poppa Pump. Everything Scott Steiner became in the late 1990s can be traced back to photographs of a man he never saw wrestle. Think about how strange that is. Scott never watched Billy Graham perform. He never saw him cut a promo live. He never sat in an arena and watched Graham walk to the ring. Everything Scott knew about Billy Graham came from the still images, photographs in muscle magazines, pictures in wrestling publications, static shots of Graham posing next to Arnold Schwarzenegger, and those photographs became an obsession. Scott has talked openly about this. He would look at pictures of Graham training with Schwarzenegger and other bodybuilding legends. And in those photos, Graham looked huge, bigger than Arnold, more imposing, more muscular, and Scott could not believe it. Here was a professional wrestler who looked bigger than one of the greatest bodybuilders of all time. That image burned into Scott's brain. It became the goal, the standard. Scott wanted to look like that, to be that. So he spent years building his body, pushing his physique to extremes, focusing on his peaks, his arms, his chest. He bleached his hair blonde. He grew the goatee. He adopted every visual element of the Graham look. And it was all based on photographs. Not matches, not promos, just still images. But Graham's influence went beyond the physique. It was the entire persona. Graham was the original bodybuilder wrestler. He changed the industry in the 1970s by proving that wrestling did not have to be about blue-collar toughness. It could be about spectacle, about being larger than life. Graham was loud, arrogant. He cut promos that rhymed but did not always make sense. He called his biceps pythons. He flexed constantly. He made wrestling about the show as much as the match. And Scott copied all of it. The blonde hair and goatee, the focus on his arms, the over-the-top promotional style, the willingness to say things that sounded insane but somehow worked. The genetic freak character is just Billy Graham in a different package. Scott has even described meeting Graham later in life as an eerie experience because they look so similar, like Scott had literally become the thing he studied in those old photographs, like he had transformed himself into a living recreation of Graham's image. Graham was WWF heavyweight champion from 1977 to 1978, and during that run, he fundamentally changed what a wrestling champion could be. Before Graham, champions were mostly traditional tough guys, blue-collar fighters, but Graham proved that a bodybuilder could be the face of the company, that you could prioritize your look over your wrestling ability and still succeed. Scott absorbed that lesson completely. When Scott needed to reinvent himself in the late 1990s, he did not look inward for inspiration. He did not try to create something original. He looked at Billy Graham. He asked himself what would make him impossible to ignore. What would make him unforgettable? And the answer was right there in those old photographs. Become the loudest, most muscular, most absurd version of yourself possible. Become Big Poppa Pump. Graham gave Scott everything: the visual identity, the promotional blueprint, the entire aesthetic that defined his biggest and most successful run. The idea that being a freak was better than being normal. That spectacle trumped substance. That if you looked like a genetic anomaly and screamed loud enough, people would pay attention. And Scott committed to it fully. He went all in on the Graham model, and it worked. For years, Scott Steiner was one of the most recognizable and talked about wrestlers in the world, not because of his technical ability, not because of great matches, but because he looked and acted like a genetic freak, because he was impossible to ignore. That is Graham's legacy in Scott Steiner. Without Billy Graham, there is no Big Poppa Pump. There is just Scott Steiner, a very good wrestler, an exceptional athlete with a legitimate amateur background, but ultimately forgettable. Just another guy who had a solid career and faded away. Graham showed Scott how to be unforgettable, how to be a freak, how to build a character so loud and visual that people could not look away. And Scott took that lesson and turned it into the defining era of his career. So here is what we are left with after looking at this list: 10 names, 10 influences, 10 pieces of the puzzle, and one deeply uncomfortable realization that Scott probably never wanted you to see this clearly. Scott Steiner did not invent anything. Not a single element of Big Poppa Pump was original. He borrowed legitimacy from Greg Wojciechowski. One match, one win, and he turned it into a 35-year justification for looking down on everyone. He borrowed the Powerhouse presence from Hawk and Animal. The Road Warriors showed him what it meant to be an unstoppable team, to be physically imposing and still athletic, to be memorable without saying much. And Scott copied that blueprint for the Steiner brothers. He borrowed paranoia and intensity from Randy Savage. The idea that wrestling was war, that everyone was trying to bury you, that you had to protect yourself at all times, that loyalty mattered more than company politics. Scott absorbed all of that from Savage and turned it into his own defensive, shoot-style mentality. He borrowed the lesson from George Steele that freaks survive longer than normal wrestlers, that being outrageous and leaning into an absurd character could sustain a decades-long career, that legitimate athletes could make more money by becoming cartoons. He borrowed everything from Rick: his entry into the business, his credibility, his protection, his partnership. And then Scott betrayed him when staying together became a threat to his own ambitions. He turned on his own brother to avoid being buried as a tag wrestler. That is theft of the worst kind. Taking everything someone gave you and then destroying them to save yourself. He borrowed the technical foundation from Steve Fraser. Every suplex, every throw, every move that made Scott look like a genetic freak came from Fraser's Olympic-level coaching. Scott did not invent those techniques. He adapted legitimate Greco-Roman wrestling and brought it into pro wrestling. He borrowed the toughness mentality from Dick the Bruiser, the idea that wrestling rewards the wild ones, the uncontrollable ones, the guys who refuse to be pushed down. Bruiser gave Scott his first title and his first taste of how the territory system worked. He borrowed brutality and the Steiner recliner from the original Sheik, the hardcore style, the idea that wrestling should feel dangerous, that violence should look real. The Sheik trained Scott to be brutal, to make fans believe someone might actually get hurt. And he borrowed absolutely everything visual and promotional from Billy Graham. The blonde hair, the goatee, the focus on muscles, the loud, nonsensical promos. The entire Big Poppa Pump persona is just Billy Graham repackaged for the 1990s. Every single element came from someone else. Big Poppa Pump was not an original creation. It was a collage, a Frankenstein monster stitched together from spare parts stolen from wrestling legends. Scott saw what worked for other people. He took their best qualities, he combined them, and he sold the result as his own invention. That is not creativity. That is not innovation. That is theft. Calculated, deliberate, shameless theft. And Scott knew exactly what he was doing. That is why he named these 10 wrestlers. Not to honor them, not to thank them, but to show you the recipe, to prove that he understood the game. He studied the best wrestlers and characters who came before him. He identified their strengths, and he stitched those strengths together into something that looked new from a distance. But it was not new. It was borrowed. Every promo, every pose, every catchphrase, every move, all of it came from someone else. Scott's actual genius was not in creation. It was in synthesis, in knowing which pieces to steal, in understanding how to combine them, and in being shameless enough to do it as loud as possible, to scream and flex and pose so much that people forgot to ask where any of it came from. Scott made theft look like innovation by doing it bigger and louder than anyone else. These 10 names are not just a list of influences. They are proof that wrestling is passed down, generation to generation, wrestler to wrestler, a chain of stolen ideas that somehow becomes something new with each person who takes it. Scott took from these 10 men. He borrowed their moves, their looks, their attitudes, their lessons, and now his son, Braun Breaker, is doing the same thing, taking from Scott, using the same explosive power, the same amateur wrestling base, the same intensity, the same family name. The cycle continues. And maybe that is the real lesson buried in this uncomfortable story. Nobody builds themselves alone. Not in wrestling, not in any competitive field, not anywhere. Scott Steiner became Big Poppa Pump because 10 men showed him how. They gave him the pieces, and he put them together. Now he is passing those pieces forward to the next generation. That is the business. That is the legacy. A never-ending chain of borrowed ideas that somehow transforms into something that feels new each time someone picks it up. Scott Steiner did not invent Big Poppa Pump, but he made it unforgettable. And in wrestling, that might be the only thing that actually matters. So which influence on this list surprised you the most? Were you shocked to learn that Billy Graham was the entire visual blueprint for Big Poppa Pump? Did you realize just how much Scott owed to his brother Rick before betraying him and turning on him at Super Brawl 1998? Did the story about buying a car from Road Warrior Animal change how you see their relationship? Or did the fact that Scott's entire finishing move came directly from the original Sheik catch you off guard? Every single one of these 10 wrestlers gave Scott a piece of what became his most famous and iconic character. And every piece was borrowed, stolen, adapted without any shame whatsoever. Drop a comment below and let me know which influence hit you the hardest. Which piece of the puzzle did you not see coming? And if you want more deep dives exactly like this one into wrestling stories that go way beyond the surface, that expose the uncomfortable truths behind the characters we grew up watching, then hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Because there are so many more stories like this waiting to be uncovered. So many more wrestlers who built their legacies by borrowing from the past. And we are going to break down every single one of them. This is just the beginning. Thanks for watching. And remember this important truth. In professional wrestling, nothing is ever truly original. It is all completely stolen. The only question is who steals the best.